We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we continue our conversation with longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner. Tim, you wrote a fantastic article this week called Poor Tim Walz, Object of, let me get these in the right order, scorn, ridicule, or pity. And I thought it was the best summation of what is happening with Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, former VP candidate on Kamala Harris's presidential ticket. And I just got to, I laughed out loud at some of the idiocies that you related during that piece. What is Tim Walz? Let's start backwards. What is Tim Walz aiming to do?
Well, I think he's aiming to make himself a candidate for the 2028 presidential nomination. Ultimately, he convinced himself that because he was on a national ticket, that he could take another step up and become a presidential candidate. And I will give him this, as much as of a fool as he's made out of himself over these last few weeks, at least he's out on the stage and he's staying in the fight, which I think one of the underreported stories right now is that Kamala Harris has essentially gone into the witness protection program. She has disappeared ever since the election after saying she would stay in the fight. Well, she's not fighting at all. He is. But unfortunately, every time he stands up to fight, he further degrades his own flagging image.
Yes. Now, let's talk about image for a moment here. So, to me, and we talked about this beforehand, but we'll include our wonderful friends listening in Radio Land on this. There's this almost polished, manufactured image of Tim Walz that the Fourth Estate is so eager to push. It's like a repetitive buzzword, like when Joe Biden, when everybody started saying he's sharp as a tack, as if anybody in the real world ever uses that phrase. And all of a sudden, every talking head in the media saying Joe Biden sharp as a tack. It's like almost begging us to challenge them that this wasn't a talking point that they've been given.
You could go down the line and look at several different instances where a word was put out there by the Democrats, and then it appeared on every single big media outlet.
Yeah, the one to watch now is Moment in Time. Keep your eyes open for that one. It's coming.
Joe Biden loved to use the expression inflection point.
Oh, yeah.
He used it for 4 years. But, it was, we're getting off track.
So back on track.
Going off on bunny trails here.
It's my favorite place to go. So the defining word of the Tim Walz revivalist gang is masculinity. And that is, whisper it, masculinity. They're trying to paint him as this epitome of masculinity. And you and I, we were talking before we recorded that you have two people on stage. You have Donald Trump dancing to the gay anthem YMCA, and you have Tim Walz trying to do his manly best. One of them looks much more masculine than the other, and it's not Tim Walz, even though Donald Trump's there dancing to YMCA. It's such a strange thing.
Tim Walz obviously has a deep insecurity about either his masculinity or the image of his masculinity. And I think it was all engendered during the presidential campaign when you had the ridiculous spots like White Dudes for Harris. Who was trying to say real men will vote for Kamala Harris. And they felt it necessary to turn Tim Walz into an alpha male. Al Gore did the same thing during the 2000 election when he brought in a consultant specifically to tell him how to dress so he would look more like an alpha
Yeah.
rather than a beta male. And so the whole thing got expanded. And apparently, Tim Walz didn't get the memo that it didn't work. It didn't work, this whole
Sure.
business of trying to seem masculine. And now he's just doubling down. And that's why I say should be an object of scorn, ridicule, or pity. And I kind of come down on the side of pity because
Yeah.
the guy's obviously never going to be president, but he thinks that he might. He thinks that being a failed and castigated uh, vice presidential nominee can give him a national stage to embellish his image. And you know what? If he learned something from the election, okay, people will listen and say, all right, now that we know the
Mm.
guy, we're willing to listen. But he's just embarrassed himself by, he piled on. We talked earlier in the show about Tesla terrorism. And in the midst of all this, uh, I mean, you literally had Molotov cocktails being tossed into Tesla dealerships, shots being fired at Teslas, and all kind of Tesla owners saying they're afraid to go out in their Tesla. They leave it in the garage and take another car or take an Uber somewhere. In the midst of all this, he goes on a stage during a tour of Republican congressional districts and brags about how he put Tesla on his stock app so he could celebrate as the value of the company kept falling. And, to say that's not a good look would be the understatement of the year, especially when he never apparently considered, and this is in my story, this is pretty well known at this point, that his own state of Minnesota's pension fund is invested in Tesla to the tune of 1.6 million shares,
That's not
which
1.6
means
million dollars. That's 1.6 million
6 million
shares. Yeah.
shares. Now, he may have actually achieved the opposite of what he intended to, because as soon as he made that comment about celebrating Tesla's drop, their stock went up by more than 20%. It had
Yeah.
dropped to 241. It was down about 41% since January. And then suddenly there was an uptick after the Tim Walz remarks. Coincidence? You decide.
Yes, he's running some strange quasi campaign here, and it's ostensibly it's there to help Democrats in Republican states, right? That's what it's for. But there's this idea that he has of himself that he will be a net benefit to whatever campaigns they're running. And if we recall from the 2024 campaign, uh, Kamala Harris was not that welcome where she was going to campaign, because she was campaigning for herself, of course, but she was on the surface saying, I'm here to help this person in this race. People didn't want her around because she was considered electorally toxic. And that proved to be fairly true, I think. And Tim Walz is essentially, he's a half of Kamala Harris. And so will he be as toxic to Democrats looking to either maintain seats or win seats in largely Republican congressional districts? Will he actually end up being a hindrance when it comes around to the 2026 midterms?
Well, let's put it this way. I don't think anybody's going to be begging for him to come into their congressional district to help with their reelection effort or even their election effort if they're not a sitting member of Congress. This is the way you can tell how toxic or lack thereof a political figure is, and that is by how many fellow members of the party want that person to show up and appear with them at events, because that's where the rubber meets the road. They can say anything they want. Oh, we love Kamala Harris, et cetera, et cetera. But it's true. Nobody that I can think of, there were probably a few, wanted either Kamala Harris or Tim Walz to come to their congressional district to appear with them. Whereas a lot did with Donald Trump. And I think that's where the rubber meets the road. And especially now that Tim Walz has gone, he went on the Gavin Newsom podcast and said he thinks that the Republicans are scared of him because he really can change an oil filter, which he changed a virgin oil filter for a virgin oil filter on camera.
Yeah.
And because he can fire a shotgun, which he proved that he can't even load one properly during the campaign, but he's still going after this masculinity thing. And he said, and this was the best part at the end, he said, I think I could kick any of their S, which is so funny because then a former WWE wrestler who is the mayor in a Tennessee county said, okay, I'll take up the fight. And he invited him to step into the ring with him. And as of now, no response from Tim Walz has been forthcoming.
Yeah, that would be one to. I'd get that on a pay-per-view. So just one
I
last.
would too. I would pay.
I would
for
watch that. I would watch that.
Yes.
Last thing on this Tim Walz, just in case you haven't been following it at all. As you know, I like to track polling, but I also like to track the betting markets, even this far out for the next president of the United States. Would you like to know Tim Walz's odds of becoming the next president of these United States?
I believe it was it 14 to 1, 40 to 1? What was it?
It's 100 to 1.
100 to 1.
He's right smack in between LeBron James, Jill Biden, and Liz Cheney. 100 to 1. And
that puts it all into perfect perspective.
It does indeed. We will bid our best to Governor Walz and the great people of Minnesota. Thanks for putting up with us. And we'll be back with Tim Donner after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.